Welcome to Oyate Today. Oyate in Lakota means people. Brought to you by Native Sun News Today. Hi, welcome to Oyate Today. I am your host, Richie Richards. Oyate Today is produced by Tim and Jackie Gallego. Tim is an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. Our guest today is Professor and author Elizabeth Cook-Lynn. Professor Cook-Lynn, thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's get right into some of the work and some of the books that you've authored. I understand you've written 14 books in your career. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Well, yes, I write, and all of my books are published by university presses.
Sure.
Which means I'm never going to make it on the bestseller list. But they are written basically for academic audiences, I guess you would say. And I publish a lot in federal Indian policy, in law, and history.
Can you talk about some of your books specifically that are used? Because I understand they're used in American Indian Studies classes.
Yes, and I guess I'm basically a Dakota writer. So much of it centers on the Great Plains and our tribe. I don't consider myself an historian. I consider myself a journalist and a writer. I don't consider myself a poet either, though I have published poetry. But my main interest is to talk about the history of the colonization of American Indian tribes in America, which is then taking us through the 1800s and 1900 and the 20th century.
Sure. So you go through the 7 major policies then, and
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not a lawyer either, but I do think that to know the history of our legal and historical issues is to know who we really are as Indians. You can learn our language if you want to. You can learn, some other things about spirituality, but you will never understand who we are unless you understand the history and the land issues and the policy of the federal government.
I understand you yourself have been a professor at Arizona State University, UC Davis, and Eastern Washington University. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I have, and that's the astonishing thing about my life. When I grew up on the Crow Creek Indian Reservation, a little kid without shoes and living in a house with 9 people in it, and poverty-stricken, I had no clue about what my life would really become.
And so, as a young Dakota growing up in South Dakota, how did you make it out to Eastern Washington University, for instance?
Well, I must say that I have always been interested in the academic life, I guess you would say, even though I knew nothing about it. I have read everything I've ever, as soon as I learned how to read English. And so I've always been a kind of a studious person. But to be very honest, I didn't publish anything until I was 40. Hey, that gives all of you closet writers some hope. And what came along was a lot of interesting time in discovering America for us, those of us who lived isolated lives on Indian reservations. And there was a federal policy that was called affirmative action. I was contacted by Jim Emery, the old Jim Emery, and he had some contacts in Aberdeen area office, and he said, would you like to get a master's degree? I already had an undergraduate degree, and I said, well, I don't know, maybe. So that was kind of the beginning of it, the beginning of my so-called academic life. I'll always be grateful to Jim Emery Sr.
So you enrolled and got your master's then?
Yes, and I went to Brookings again and to Vermilion. So that's where I got my education.
And so when we talk about American Indian studies and the importance of American Indian studies in our colleges and universities, how is that important for you in your life? How was that important for you to teach in these classes, in these areas, in these subjects?
Well, like all of us, I had no real educational opportunities to learn. And so when American Indian Studies as an academic discipline started emerging in the 60s and 70s, that's when I really began to know that I was going to write seriously, that I was going to teach.
So for like a young writer or a closet writer, as you had talked about earlier, what can you say to those young people who want to write books, who want to get involved in writing books? What did you do in order to make that possible?
Well, there are a couple of things. One of them is you have to get away from the me stuff. Don't write a whole bunch of stuff about yourself. Try to read, try to look at other writers, try to move out of your own traumas. That isn't easy for Indians. You know, I think we're a traumatized people, generally speaking, not just the Sioux, but Navajos and everybody else. And so you have to move away from your own trauma and read and research and write.
Yes.
Even if you don't publish anything, write it. You can throw it in file 9 if you want to, but write. You have to write every day. Any basketball player will tell you he doesn't become a star by sitting around thinking about basketball. He gets out there every day and does the work.
Yeah. And so when you talk about kind of avoiding or not using our own trauma as inspiration for writing, but it's that historical trauma of American Indians that is the source of inspiration for many then.
Oh, absolutely it is, and it's real. It's a real thing. I don't zero in on my own personal traumas. I don't tell you about the struggle on an Indian reservation when you have absolutely nothing and there is no potential. I don't go there a lot.
So what is the importance of teaching law and policy through American Indian Studies? I understand that that's very important for your life and what you've done in your career. So,
well, it is, and I think that you also have to have some help from your family. I come from a very political family. Many of my relatives are Sisitwa. You know, they're the people who moved away from the Little Crow War in 1862 in Minnesota. And the reservation I come from, Crow Creek, is a concentration camp for the people who rode with Little Crow in 1862. And so I come from a bunch of political people, a bunch of men who thought they were politicians and who spent a lot of time discussing that and thinking about it. It was part of our family discussions, as a matter of fact. I don't come from a very religious family, but they are political.
and so that's in your family line, in your lineage then?
Yes, it is. My grandpa was, he was Tatiopa, was his Indian name, and he was one of the first councilmen elected to the tribal council at Fort Thompson in 1932 or 34 or whenever it was. And he was a huge influence, as was his wife, who was a Renville from Siston, South Dakota. That's a very famous name among the Renvilles, among the Dakotas, the Situa. And so they were influential. I had a grandmother who didn't speak English, And so I learned the language also along with that.
Sure. Professor Cook-Lynn, we're going to take a break and get a word from our sponsors. When we get back, we're going to learn a little bit more about the First Nations Sculpture Garden that's due to go up here in November in Rapid City. So we'll be back after a word from our sponsors.
This year, for a Christmas like no other, shop the store like no other. Prairie Edge Trading Company. And while you're in the store, don't forget to register to win a $1,000 gift certificate. Prairie Edge, like no other.
Our school has great students and dedicated teachers, but we need our community volunteers to help us to provide a broader view of the many ways a good education can point to a bright future.
Did someone say volunteer? Our team at Black Hills is here to help. In fact, we sponsor events and projects, and our employees volunteer for organizations throughout the Black Hills, including partnering with schools to help students learn more about life outside the classroom. Extracurricular, extra fun.
You can't predict life's ups and downs. You just give it all you've got to stay on top. But it's easier with a partner like Security First Bank. Since 1898, we've been riding with you through the country's biggest ups and downs. And this is where we'll stay. Security First Bank, a relationship you can count on. Member FDIC.
Native Sun News has been voted the best weekly newspaper in its class for 2015 by the South Dakota and North Dakota Newspaper Associations. You can find a copy of the Native Sun News at many businesses and vending machines in Rapid City and the surrounding area, and on all 9 reservations. We publish every Wednesday, so advertisers and subscribers can reach our diverse readership by calling 605-721-1266. The Native Sun News covers the other side of the story.
Hi, welcome back to Oyate Today. I'm your host, Richie Richards. Our guest tonight is Professor and author Elizabeth Cook-Lynn. Before the break, we talked a little bit about the career of Professor Cook-Lynn, and one of the things that she's working on currently is bringing the First Nations Sculpture Garden to Halley Park in Rapid City. And if you could give me a little bit of history about the efforts of bringing these 4 busts, and if you could tell me who's in the 4 busts actually, and then we'll kind of go on from there.
Yes, well, actually, these are 20th century scholars in medicine, in art, in philosophy, and law. And that's a deliberate choice. I worked with a group of Sioux Indian people from the reservations, and we wanted to say something about what occurred in the 20th century concerning education and progress in that field, in those fields.
And for our viewers who are not aware of who these 4 busts are, could you tell the names of these individuals?
Yes, it's amazing to me that nobody except Indians knows who these people are. You can talk to people on the street of Rapid City and they never heard of Charles Eastman. And his father brings many lightnings. He was from Siston and Minnesota, and he rode with Little Crow, and he was put in jail for and it's penitentiary for 10 years. By that time, when he went home, he told his son, there is no room for Indians here. You'll have to become a white man. That's basically the message of the 20th century.
Yes. So you have Charles Eastman, and then who else exactly?
And then, and so he did. He changed his name to Eastman. Then we have Nick Black Elk. Everybody knows Black Elk in this part of the country. He was born in 1863 along the Little Powder River, and he became the most important religious leader of our period. Then there's Oscar Howe. I was born 3 miles from where Oscar Howe was born on the Crow Creek Indian Reservation. He was Ihangzuma, and he was born in 1915, which Helen Hunt Jackson called the years of disaster. And that's true. Then we have Vine Deloria, who of course was born about the time I was, and his first important book was Custer Died for Your Sins. Everybody knows that one, I suppose. But he was the director of the National Congress of American Indians for some time before he went back to law school. He wrote the history that designates where the tribes wanted to go in this century and into the next century, and did some very important work. He said, for example, that the Bering Strait was a scientific myth. Every Dakota I know believes we did not come from Asia across the Bering Strait, that we have always been here, that we are Great Plains indigenous people. And of course, he was, ostracized by most scholars. Sure. But he was a very, very important person in the 20th century in law and policy.
And so you've actually been a part of a very significant part of bringing these 4 busts who the sculptor, I understand, is Marilyn Wounded Head. Could you talk to me a little bit about Marilyn?
Marilyn Wounded Head was and is a member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. She was born and raised at Pine Ridge. And when we started this, we did not want it to be taken over by non-Siouan people. And so she was our first choice and our only choice. She's a marvelous artist, a marvelous sculptress. And this is a picture of her early work. She had a foundry that she worked with in Santa Fe or somewhere like that in New Mexico. Sure. And so this is, these are the busts in bronze that she did for us.
So this is the final version of the busts that are going to go up in Helly Park?
Yes,
then?
And they will be on pedestals, and there will be some inscription for all of them.
And you also brought along a photo of the area in Helly Park in which these busts...
Yes, this is interesting because we also wanted this park place. Setting is terribly important in all of Indian history. You know, the Sioux do not do the Sundance in Cincinnati. Sure. We do it here. And so this is a part of the 1868 treaty boundaries. It's within the boundaries of the 1868 treaty. So when we look at the timeline of these men, we are working within that treaty alliance.
Within that time frame, 1868 forward, and yes. Their lives specifically.
Yes, yes, and the 1868 treaty influences all of us, you and me, everybody in Indian country.
Including the town of Rapid City.
Including the town of Rapid City, absolutely. Although, if you listen to the Rapid City founders, you wouldn't know that we were even here. I'll tell you a joke about that. I think it's a joke. I don't know for sure. But when I started this project with the board that we had gathered up, several people from this city said, well, why don't you put those? They didn't really like the place that we were trying to put it. And they said, why don't you put those statues there where the Founders Park is? Sure. Without a touch of irony. I thought maybe it was satire, I don't know. But we are not the founders of Rapid City. Sure. We are the indigenous people of Rapid City who have always been here.
Mm-hmm. So that that place in Helly Park, between Main and St. Joseph Streets in Rapid City, very significant area.
Very significant, and I told them in the beginning, we won't do this if you insist on it being somewhere else. And we did have to get a memorandum of understanding from the city, and we did. But that took a year for us to convince them that this was a good thing.
Professor Cook-Lynn, we're going to take another break here, but when we get back, we'll learn a little bit more about the First Nations Sculpture Garden in Halley Park. So we'll be back after these messages. Thank you.
If you're talking, they will hear you.
Why are we getting killed like this?
Kyle's not here. Got caught drinking beer in the park a couple of nights ago.
Really?
Yeah, 0 tolerance. He's out for the season.
Harsh.
Hey, he knew not to drink. We've made that clear to all of our kids, right?
No, not really.
Bill, if we don't tell them what we expect and why they shouldn't drink, how are they gonna know?
Talk. They hear you.
You can do it if you try.
If youth and family services weren't available in this community, there would be a lot of unmet basic needs. Very few organizations do as good a job as Youth and Family Services, getting every ounce of usefulness out of people's time, their dollars that they donate.
Youth and Family Services help so many kids. It's a great value to the community.
Join me, because together we help kids.
I used to think news is news. It's all the same, but it's not. There's a big difference between local broadcast news and cable news. See, local stations are part of my community, connecting me to local news, weather, and sports on every device. It makes sense. Get the news from the people I trust who actually live here. No agenda, no bias like on cable shout shows or social media, just facts. For news I can trust, I stay local. Support your local stations. Text TV to 52886 today.
The aftermath from the recent hurricanes and tropical storms have devastated thousands of communities. You can help the millions of Americans who are affected by these storms. Show your support today. Go to our app or blackhillsfox.com/hurricane relief and make a donation today.
Hi, welcome back to Oyate Today. I am your host, Richie Richards. Our guest tonight is Professor Elizabeth Cook-Lynn. And before the break, we had a great discussion about the First Nations Sculpture Garden in Halley Park. And if you want to continue as to what you were discussing, I understand you want to read an excerpt from one of your pamphlets there. So,
thank you. Yes, we are putting out, and we have put out, a pamphlet for those people who came to our installation back in November.
Sure.
And in this little pamphlet, there's quite a lot of discussion about the overview of the 20th century. The 20th century is, of course, influenced by the wars, Powder River, everywhere, and influenced by the agreements that are made between nations of people, and that's what treaties are. So I want to read a little bit. The Sioux Tribe, Great Sioux Nation, and the United States of America, both sovereign nations, began in war and native resistance to occupation. Treaties were an effort to end 30 years of engaged conflict. Treaties are the means through which nations come to agreements. So we talk a lot about the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, 51 too, and it was a peace treaty. It was not a treaty for the exchange of land. I want to just read 4 items from this agreement. Number 1, peace between the indigenous tribal nation signers and the United States of America. Peace. Number 2, it established the boundaries of the Great Sioux Nation. My father, as a politician, talked about the Great Sioux Nation all the time. Number 3, no whites are to be allowed on these sovereign lands if unauthorized by Indian tribes. And number 4, no further Sioux lands are subject to purchase. Well, it comes as no surprise that the Treaty of Fort Laramie holds the principle of consent, and so there has been a lot of discussion back and forth. Unfortunately, The first principle to be violated was the principle of consent. The 20th century policy quickly saw that the United States would become superior. And the Sioux Nation did not have credible access to the U.S. court system until well into the 20th century. So these are the conditions that influence the lives of these men who are in this garden, and all of our relatives and all the people that we know and depend on. There is a huge, huge history here, and much of it is ignored. And Indians have tried, the Sioux have tried for years to say what it is that they need to say, and it's been very, very difficult.
So on some level, it almost seems that these four gentlemen that are represented in the First Nation Sculpture Garden made the most of the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 and made a career based on their survival of such terms.
Well, they did, and that's true of all of our relatives, yours and mine. The accommodations made by Native people is, on one hand, an outrage. On the other hand, it's a miracle. And that's the joy of this particular monument. It is a momentous occasion to say that these people have achieved their best work during this period.
So with Rapid City being a tourist destination, we are definitely going to be, as residents and as local citizens, we're going to all benefit from the Sculpture Garden. But how would visitors and tourists who are not familiar with this area and the treaties and the things that are associated with the local tribes, how is this going to help with tourism, say, for instance?
Well, that's always the question that people ask of us. That's the least important thing to me. I suppose Rapid City wants to know the answer to that. I don't really have an answer. What I think this monument is, it's for us, and it's for our children, and it's for the future. Nobody's going to make any money on this, you see, and that's what tourism is, basically. And that's unfortunate, I suppose. Everybody who has worked on this has done it pro bono. We are a 501c3, and if anybody would like to donate to us, they are certainly welcome to do so. You can send a check to Box 9515 at Rapid City.
Thank you, Professor Cook-Lynn, and thank you for making Oyate today a part of your night. You've been watching Oyate Today, brought to you by Native Sun News Today.